Alleluia, 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 Alleluia. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus said to the crowds, "This is how it is with the kingdom of God. It is as if a man were to scatter seed on the land, and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow. He knows not how. Of its own accord, the land yields fruit. First the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. And when the grain is ripe, he wields the sickle at once, for the harvest has come." He said, "To what shall we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable can we use for it? It is like a mustard seed, that when it is sown in the ground is the smallest of all the seeds on the earth. But once it is sown, it springs up and becomes the largest of plants, and puts forth large branches, that the birds of the sky can dwell in its shade." With many such parables, he spoke the word to them, as they were able to understand it. Without parables, he did not speak to them, but to his own disciples he explained everything in private. The Gospel of the Lord. Today is January 27th, and we will not be having daily Mass tomorrow, but tomorrow is the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas. So I think St. Thomas Aquinas is very important in the history of the church and also important in our modern day. So I want to just share some thoughts about St. Thomas Aquinas. If he's not somebody who you're familiar with, right, you should familiar yourself with St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas lived in the 1200s. He was a contemporary with St. Albert the Great. In fact, St. Albert the Great was his teacher. He was also contemporary with St. Bonaventure. St. Thomas Aquinas represents one of the culminating times in church history. He represents scholasticism. Scholasticism is basically the joining of philosophy with theology, right? The heights of human reason, right, coming into harmony with theology, God's revelation. And so St. Thomas Aquinas famously, he basically harmonized Aristotle, who is considered the greatest of the ancient philosophers, and he harmonized him with the Christian faith. He showed that Aristotle was basically a precursor or a forerunner to God's ultimate revelation. Aristotle was like the shadow, and Christ is the reality, right? And so you see this harmony between faith and reason. St. Thomas Aquinas was also he was important in the history of church doctrine because it was in the 1200s when the doctrine of transubstantiation began to be questioned. There were some people who were not believing in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and so St. Thomas Aquinas was the one who came up with the definition of transubstantiation. Now, don't be confused. Sometimes non-Catholic Christians will try to say, see, Catholics never believed in transubstantiation until the 1200s. That's not what happened, okay? Catholics have always believed in the real presence. It's just that it wasn't fully defined until the 1200s because it was questioned, right? And so there was clarity to the doctrine. This is how doctrine works. Whenever things are questioned, the church then defines them more clearly, right? And that's how we get dogmas and doctrines, right? Same way in the 1800s when the Vatican and the Pope finally defined the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It wasn't as if nobody believed that beforehand. It was that it had been questioned. And so the church had to come out and define that doctrine, right, and re-articulate it. Now, the reason why I think St. Thomas Aquinas is so significant for us is because he valued the power of the mind so much, right? In our modern age, especially in the church, the faith has been largely unintellectualized. Some famous examples you can find, right? You'll go to Catholic high schools and Catholic schools, and you'll see these students reading these huge, thick, complicated textbooks, right? And the very difficult texts of their various subjects. And then you'll go to the religion class, and you'll find basically children's books, right? Or picture books. We are pretending like the faith is not intellectually serious. And because of that, there are so many people leaving the church because they don't think the faith is intellectually justifiable. They think all the other realms of knowledge are serious, but religion is not serious. It is more like a myth or a fairy tale. And so it's very important for us as Catholics to know the intellectual foundations for our faith. When people have doubts about the faith, we have to know how to respond to those doubts in an intellectual way. We have to be able to give arguments and reasons for our faith and for the rationality of our faith. And so I think, personally, our religious education classes should be much more rigorous than they are. I think in order to be confirmed, I think we should be much more rigorous with the demands we make on our students. I remember I had a friend who was a convert to the Catholic Church, and she had grown up as a Lutheran, and she said that in order to be confirmed, she basically had to stand in front of a panel of the different ministers of her church, and they had to fire questions at her, and she had to be able to respond in order to get confirmed. And I think that would be awesome. We should do something like that today, right? Teaching people to intellectually defend the faith. And you don't have to be a super brainiac or a genius to do it either. There's so many resources out there to learn these arguments. They're not really that complicated. So many of the things that modern people say against religion is so easily refutable. We just have to take the time to think through it and to learn and realize those things. The other reason I like St. Thomas Aquinas a lot is because he shows us how to engage in those intellectual conversations and debates with people. In our modern age, you tend to see people having two different extremes when it comes to argumentation and debates. You'll have on one extreme, you'll find people who say things like, well, we just shouldn't talk about religion, right? Because it just leads to a bunch of hard feelings, right? And bad conversations, and so we shouldn't even try. And as well as that, on top of that, sometimes people think that in order to disagree with somebody, it's like you're attacking them, right? And so therefore, we shouldn't ever have those disagreements. We just shouldn't talk about it. We should agree to disagree, right? And just leave it alone. St. Thomas Aquinas would greatly disagree with that. His writings are literally full of arguments. The Summa Theologia, the Summa Contra Gentiles, everything that he wrote, it's full of arguments. The entire book is explaining to people why they are incorrect and why this particular view is correct. He wasn't afraid of arguments, and I don't think we should be afraid of arguments either. But the key is, how do we argue well? This is where I think, again, Aquinas is very helpful. In our modern age, when we engage in debates and arguments with people, sometimes we can be overly dismissive of the ones we are arguing with. Sometimes we can pretend, or we can think to ourselves, that they're just ignorant, and there's no point of even continuing the argument. One of the things you see in our modern day is the logical fallacy called the ad hominem fallacy. Right? What is that? Well, that means when somebody's disagreeing with you and making an argument, what do? Instead of talking about their argument, you start to attack them as a person. We see this all the time in politics, for example. When people have debates, right, they begin to immediately go to that person's private life, right? And they begin to point out all their flaws as if that was an actual refutation to their opinion. No, it was just a personal attack. Right? What's really amazing about Aquinas when you read his writings and the arguments that he makes is basically he takes opposing viewpoints and he re-articulates them in a way that is even stronger and more intelligent than his opponent had originally articulated. He takes the time to truly understand what the opposing person is saying and articulates it in such an accurate way that then he is able to refute it. And I think that would be very helpful for us. One of the things that I personally like to see when people are in arguments or debating against one another is I think it's good when the opposing side has to re-articulate the opposing view of the other person, just to make sure that they truly understand it. Aquinas didn't see his opponents as enemies. He saw them as someone who was on the right track, who just needed to be corrected. And I think we could use that a lot, especially as Catholics, since we believe we have the fullness of truth, we believe we are in the right. But that doesn't mean that everybody else is wrong about everything. It just means that we have to help them get a little bit further along in the truth. I think we could learn a lot from St. Thomas Aquinas and the way that he carried himself. And I think it would be very beneficial for us in the church if we tried to learn from his example.